Although many conservation and environmental protection efforts and laws only date back to the Nixon administration, the importance of prudent management of the working forest was recognized more than a century ago. For example, in his 1905 Primer of Forestry, Gifford Pinchot, the nation's first professional forester, made the following observations about timberland management. The products of the forest are among the things which civilized men cannot do without. Wood is needed for building, for fuel, for paper pulp, and for unnumbered other uses, and trees must be cut down to supply it. It would be both useless and mistaken to try and stop the cutting of timber, for it would not cease without great injury, not to the lumbermen only, but to all the people of the nation. The question is not of saving the trees, for every tree must inevitably die, but of saving the forest by conservative ways of cutting the trees. If the forest is to be preserved, the timber crop must now be gathered in such a way as to make sure of other crops hereafter. One of the earliest and most prominent proponents of the notion of prudent forest management was Berlin, New Hampshire businessman William Robinson, or W.R. Brown, who oversaw Brown Company's timberlands for more than 3 decades beginning in 1900. In this film, we will examine W.R. Brown's career, which illustrates how land, labor, and business have interacted in New Hampshire timberlands during the past century. The story of W.R. Brown and the paper products company that bore his family name are products of the Industrial Revolution that took place in the last half of the 19th century in the United States. The Industrial Revolution produced 4 key changes in the mid-19th century that impacted New Hampshire's northern forest. 1. The arrival of the railroad. 2. Improvements in water power. 3. The decline of agriculture. And 4. Technological innovations in paper making. With the advent of the railroad came increased access to the northern forest. This obviously had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side were economic advantages such as increased tourism and the ability to get products to market faster and in larger quantities. On the negative side, the increased tourism brought increased demand for the construction of hotels and a corresponding need to use more of the untapped forest. By providing access to remote regions, the railroads helped spawn the age of the portable sawmill. In 1870 alone, according to New Hampshire architectural historian Dr. James Garvin, there were more than 640 sawmills in New Hampshire. No other area, including Canada, had as many documented mills. The second important technological development was in the area of water power. By the 1850s, water turbines were more durable and efficient than vertical water wheels. Turbines were horizontal and submerged in waterways, and therefore were unaffected by frequent flooding or fluctuating water levels, and were able to operate at much higher speeds. The new water turbines enabled mills to harness the power of larger, faster rivers such as the Androscoggin. The third factor was the decline of the family farm. By 1862, with the passage of the Homestead Act, farming, which had always been difficult, began to decline in New Hampshire as more farmers sought to make a life for themselves and their families in the more easily cultivated Great Plains. Finally, innovations in papermaking transformed the industry. By 1867, changes in papermaking technology allowed small manufacturers to substitute groundwood pulp fibers for rags and newsprint. Spurred on by this technology, the industry relocated along waterways in close proximity to large timber sources. It was not long before the papermaking industry in northern New England outspaced sawmills in the consumption of trees. It was in this context that the business that eventually became Brown Company was established in 1852, when a group of Portland, Maine businessmen formed a partnership under the name H. Winslow and Company. The group recognized that the construction of a railroad line, coupled with the availability of the new turbine technology, made the Androscoggin River Valley an ideal place in which to locate a highly productive sawmill with the corresponding means to get their product to market. In 1868, the company changed its name to the Berlin Mills Company. That same year, William Wentworth Brown of Portland bought out one of the original partners. At that time, the company owned 20,000 acres of land. W. W. Brown believed that he needed to buy as much timberland as possible in order to keep the mill profitable. By 1900, the company owned 400,000 acres of land. W. W. Brown, along with the other Brown family members, purchased the remaining shares of stock in 1880 and acquired complete control of the company. W. W. Brown, always ready to embrace change, immediately began to expand and diversify the production facilities at the Berlin Mills Company. Brown had 3 sons by his first wife. The oldest, Herbert Jenkins Brown, operated the company for a short time before returning to Portland to oversee all of the family operations. The second son, Orton Bishop Brown, would assume responsibility for the management of the Berlin operations. The third and youngest son from Brown's first marriage, W.R. Brown, was born in 1875. Like his brothers before him, he attended Williams College and graduated in 1897. He spent the next 3 years working a number of jobs in the Words Department before taking over as the department manager in 1900. W.R. Brown assumed the leadership of his company's woods department at a key moment in the history of forest management, the professionalization of the forest products industry, and the development of early forestry practices at the close of the 19th century. The concept of industrial engineering had taken root in this period. In the 1870s, Frederick Taylor, a graduate of Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, who was appalled by the chaos he found in industrial workplaces, had begun a series of efficiency experiments. Taylor developed an array of scientific management techniques to cut manufacturing costs based on three factors: positioning of machinery to minimize the movement of material from one point to another, the subdivision of labor, and detailed cost accounting to keep track of all expenses. Taylor's efficiency observations were often controversial, yet they spawned a movement in many segments of society to examine waste, especially in government. An incipient conservation movement had also gained traction by 1900. President Theodore Roosevelt had championed notions of efficiency and government regulation to curb waste in and destruction of the nation's forests. In 1905, Roosevelt appointed professional forester Gifford Pinchot as the head of the U.S. Division of Forestry. Like Roosevelt, Pinchot believed that conservation required the application of methods of scientific management to natural resources. He was not an environmentalist, for the science of ecology had not yet emerged in this period. Pinchot believed that the first principle of conservation was industrial development in a manner that exploited nature in an appropriate manner to ensure the wisest use of the natural resources now existing on this continent for the benefit of people who live here now. Both Pinchot and Roosevelt championed the systematic management of natural resources by government experts trained to promote the most efficient use of the environment. It was in this environment of scientific management and progressive notions of forestry that William Robinson Brown came of age, and it is in New England where many of the early experiments and developments in forestry management took root. Brown was eager to employ the principles of scientific management in Berlin Mills Company's woods operations. Writing many decades later, W.R. Brown observed that in 1881, as Berlin Mills Company was preparing to expand its pulp and paper making operations, New Hampshire awoke to the realization that the continued depletion of the forest had reached a point where reproduction was becoming necessary to sustain the industries dependent upon wood and to conserve water supply and scenery. According to Brown, the industry responded by calling for the establishment of U.S. forestry schools and by forming the American Forestry Association in 1882. Unlike sawmill logging, the pulp and paper industry was wedded to the environment. Papermakers could not pick up the mills and relocate them at will. The entire process of producing paper also required, and still requires, a large volume of water. Moreover, it was not cost efficient to haul logs from increasingly longer distances as forests around the mills were depleted. Brown recognized that it was in the best interest of the pulp and paper mills to develop methods of sustainable forestry. In 1898, after hearing a report given by Austin Carey of the U.S. Forest Service, O.B. Brown, with encouragement from W.R., engaged Carey as a forestry consultant to Berlin Mills Company. In 1894, Carey had returned from studying forestry in Germany and was immediately employed by the U.S. Forest Service in Maine. Carey became the first privately employed forester in America. The Browns were interested in having him report on the condition of their forest lands and woods operations on the 300,000 acres they owned in northern New Hampshire and the Rangeley Lake region in Maine. Carey spent most of his time expanding his studies of spruce growth. After his study, Carey made a number of recommendations for the improvement of both the health of the forest and the conditions in logging camps. The latter were not well received by the loggers, for they involved taking showers and the elimination of card games. For W.R. Brown, however, the role of the forester in the company's woods operations was indispensable. Following Carey's tenure, Brown hired the American-trained foresters from Yale and Maine schools of forestry to continue Carey's work.